Hi everybody. Well, I said I was hoping the next time we were talking that we would be celebrating a Packers victory, but that did not happen. But here's the good news: math is not going anywhere. We still got a lot of exciting stuff going on in the math world, so we're gonna be okay. So let's get into it. So on the previous video, remember we talked about how we were evaluating algebraic expressions. Again, we're building towards that time when we're going to be solving algebraic equations, which is coming very, very shortly. In fact, maybe even next week. We'll get into that. But this next week, or this previous week that we're finishing up right now, this week yet, as I'm making this video on Friday, we continue to build, and we started this week talking about something called combining like terms. So what we began with this week was looking at some vocabulary and breaking down this thing that we call an algebraic expression. So when we look at an algebraic expression, something like this, we talked about how this expression is broken up into terms. So if you were in science class or social studies class, when they mention the word terms or key terms or define the key terms, they're talking about words. Well, again, in the math world, we don't use words very often. We use numbers and symbols. So in this case, our terms would be the parts that make up the expressions. Okay? A good way to identify the terms are there are operations, I should say, that separate the terms. So a plus, a minus, a subtract, a multiply, divide. Those are the things that separate out our terms. So terms are typically numbers or variables or a combination of a number and a variable. Those are our terms. So we talked first of all about just identifying the terms, and then there are other vocabulary words that are really foundational and basic that kids need to understand for going into this algebra unit. So another concept we talked about, or another term I should say, is the word coefficient. So a coefficient, we talked about the prefix co and how that co talks about working together, collaborating, cooperating. So in this case, the coefficient is the number that's collaborating with the variable. So the 3 and the 4 would be our coefficient. Okay? And those coefficients are going to be really important to identify in what we're going to talk about in a moment here. And then we also talked about things called constants. Now, constants is not a new word because we talked about constant earlier this year when we talked about the constant of proportionality. And we talked about the fact that a constant doesn't change. It stays the same. So in this case, our constant in this expression would be 2. Notice there's nothing attached to the 2 that's going to change it. Whereas in the 4x and the 3x, once we identify what the x is, so if I say x is 2, well now that's going to change the 4 because we're going to multiply the 4 by the 2 and it's now changed. So that can change, whereas the constant stays the same. That 2 remains a 2. Okay? So now, why did we need to identify these words? Why do we need to identify specifically the coefficient? Well, after we went through these notes and went through this vocabulary, we started talking about, again, combining like terms. So if we look at this expression as a whole, 3x plus 2 plus 4x, there are 2 terms that are alike, the 3x and the 4x. Now what makes them alike is that they share a common variable. Both of these coefficients are attached to an x and only x. Notice it's not an x squared, notice it's not a yx. They're both just x. They're exactly the same variables. So we would say that these are like terms. So we can combine them. So what we're going to do to combine them is we're simply going to look at their coefficients. So we have 3x and 4x. So the coefficients are 3 and 4. And all I have to do is add them together to make 7x. So my simplified version of this expression would now just simply be 7x plus 2. So if you remember in last week's video, when we talked about the distributive property and other properties that we're using, we're focusing on making the expression simpler, okay? And that's why we call it simplifying the expression. And that's the goal. And that's what I keep on reinforcing with students is our goal is not to make your life more complicated. The goal actually with math is to make it more simple, to make the problem simpler so we can solve it. So that now, as we moved on in last week, or this week, we then looked at expressions that had a lot of stuff going on. So now we had expressions that looked like this. Okay, and this is again how we This is how we ended the week, and we actually ended with a quiz on Thursday that students took to share with me how they are doing with putting all the pieces together. So if you look at this one expression, notice we have a lot going on. Notice, first of all, I notice right here that we have a property that we talked about the last couple weeks called the distributive property. So if I were to simplify this expression, I would use the distributive property and I would distribute that 3 with what's inside the parentheses, x plus 2. Okay, now if students were thinking of the order of operations, they would say, well, I have to do what's inside the parentheses first, so I have to add the x plus 2. But remember what we just talked about, like terms. Well, I can't add an x plus 2 because they're not like terms. That 2 does not have an x next to it, so I can't combine them. So the only thing I can do is I can simplify that part of the expression by using the distributive property. So I'm going to distribute the 3 with the x to make 3x, plus I'm going to distribute that 3 with the positive 2 to make 6. And now I'm just going to bring everything down. Okay? Now, last week we would have been done. We just had one little simple expression using the distributive property because that was our focus, that's what we're working on. Well, now we have more going on. We have other terms that we can still combine. For example, I have this 3x, and I have, now this is the part that students, we spent a little time on because this is the part that you really have to observe, and it goes back to that word evaluate. Look at the expression as a whole, and look at what we can do to evaluate this to make sure we're seeing things like this right here, where if I look at that 4, that minus sign, this goes back to our unit called operating with signed numbers, that's a negative 4. So if I miss that and I just combine the 3x and the 4x to make 7x, I'm going to get it wrong. This is actually 3x minus 4x, which is actually going to give me a negative 1x. Or I could also just say negative x. And now I move on to the other terms that I can combine. I notice that I have a positive 6. Notice it has no variable attached to it. And I have another positive 6. No variable attached to it. Again, remember we call those constants. Those two I can combine to make positive 6 plus 12. Or again, if I use that. So in either case, this is how my expression would end. I have now simplified that expression as far as I can go. I cannot combine these two terms because they're not alike. This one doesn't have an x, this one does have an x. And so this is where we ended this past week. Took a short quiz on simplifying algebraic expressions. And judging by our scores on the quiz, we're going to spend a little bit more time on this the beginning of next week before we take a summative assessment looking like on Wednesday of this coming week. So, and that test will be on all of this, what we just did. So evaluating algebraic expressions and then using properties, combining like terms to simplify algebraic expressions before we then finally do move into making this expression into an equation by now adding an equal sign and some stuff on the other side of it. So now we have a complete thought and now we can actually solve that equation. So again, that's what we're building for. So looking forward to another great week. Hope you guys had a good weekend and we'll see you this week. Bye.